The rain had stopped an hour before, but the road through Penfold village still held the storm in its ruts, brown water standing in every hollow where the cobbles dipped toward the green. Phoebe stood at the edge of it with a basket of mended linen against her hip, and her gray woolen skirt held a careful inch above the wet, and she was thinking of nothing more dangerous than the bread she had been sent to fetch when the carriage came around the churchyard wall too fast for the turning. She heard the horses before she saw them, the wet drum of hooves, the crack of a whip held by a hand that did not need to use it. She had time to step back. She did not have time to step far enough. The wheel found the standing water square and threw it in a long brown sheet, and it took her across the front of her gown, and her clean apron, and the side of her face, and the cold of it stopped her breath. The linen in her basket was ruined. She stood very still in the road with the water running off her chin, and she did not cry out because a woman in service learns early that the first lesson of being splashed is to make no sound that might be called a complaint. The carriage did not stop. It slowed, which was worse, because slowing meant the man inside had seen. The window was down. A face leaned to it, young and handsome, and entirely unbothered, and a gloved hand rested on the sill, and the mouth beneath the fashionable disorder of dark curls curved into something that was almost a smile and was certainly not an apology. "Mind the road, girl," the man said, his voice carrying easily across the wet air, light with the pleasure of his own wit. Then he rapped the roof with his knuckle, and the carriage gathered its horses and was gone, and Phoebe stood alone in the brown water with her ruined linen, and the village windows watched, and not one of them opened. What the man in the carriage did not see, because he had already turned his handsome head away, was the old woman on the churchyard bench beneath the yew. He had not noticed her when he passed. Few people did. She sat very upright in plain black bombazine with a stick of dark wood between her two gloved hands, and she had watched the whole of it, the speed and the sheet of water and the curve of the mouth that did not apologize. And she had not moved at all. Only her eyes had moved. They had gone from the man's handsome face to the girl's, still one, and they had stayed there a long moment after the wheels were gone, and something behind them had quietly, finally made up its mind. Let me ask you to hold that image, the upright old woman beneath the yew and the silent girl in the road, because everything that followed turned upon a thing neither of them said aloud that morning. Then let me take you back, only a little way, to who they were before the mud. Phoebe Larkspur was 24 years old, and she had been 3 years in service at Hartwell. She had not always been a maid. Her father had been the curate at Penfold for the whole of her childhood, a gentle, scholarly man with a small living and a smaller fortune, and she had grown up in a parsonage of borrowed books and threadbare carpets, taught Latin enough to spoil her for the kitchen, and French enough to be useless in it. When the fever took her father in the space of one wet October, it took the living with him, for a curate's daughter has no claim on the house her father served in. The new curate had a wife. The wife had her own people. And Phoebe at 21 with a small trunk and a smaller character of good conduct had walked up the long avenue to the great house at Hartwell and asked the housekeeper for work. She had been given it. Mrs. Bidman Tyndall, the housekeeper, was a hard woman with a fair one hidden inside her like a stone in fruit, and she had looked at Phoebe's clean hands and her curate's grammar and had said only that fine manners scrubbed no grates, and then she had set her to scrubbing grates. Phoebe had scrubbed them. She had carried coal and turned mattresses, and mended the household linen with stitches so small the laundry maids brought her their tears to hide, and she had done it all with a stillness that the other servants first mistrusted, and then, slowly, came to lean upon. She did not gossip. She did not complain. When she was wronged, she went quiet, and her quiet had a weight to it that made the wrongdoer uneasy without quite knowing why. The great house at Hartwell belonged in name to a dukedom older than the village church, and the dukedom belonged, in that summer, to no one at all. The old duke had died in the spring without a son, and the title and the entailed land would pass, by the cold arithmetic of the law, to the nearest male of the line, who was a young man named Crispin Vane. He was the old duke's great-nephew by a younger branch, and he had spent the better part of his 25 years in the certainty that this house would one day be his, and the certainty had done to him what such certainty often does. It had hollowed him and gilded the hollow. He was handsome, and he knew it. He was clever, and he used it on no one but himself. And he had not yet been formally confirmed in the title, for the documents moved slowly, and the lawyers moved slower. But in his own mind he was already the Duke of Hartwell, and he had ridden through Penfold that morning, as a man rides through a place he believes he owns. The dukedom was not the whole of Hartwell, and this is the thing Crispin Vane had never troubled himself to understand. The entailed land and the title went to him by law. The rest, the great unentailed fortune that the family had built over 4 generations of careful marriages, the money that paid the wages and mended the roofs and kept the dukedom from being a cold stone shell, the rest of it belonged, every last guinea of it, to the old duke's widowed sister. She was the upright woman beneath the yew. Her name was Augusta, and the village called her the Dowager Lady Wycombe. And she had buried a husband and 2 sons and a brother, and she had grown old with her eyes very wide open, and she could leave her fortune to anyone she chose. She had not yet chosen. The whole county knew she had not yet chosen, and the whole county had spent the spring arranging itself around the question. Crispin assumed the money would come to him with the title, because in his world the things he wanted arranged themselves into his hands. The dowager had let him assume it. She was a woman who had learned the value of letting a man show himself fully before she answered him. And she had been watching her great-nephew all that spring, with the patience of a person who has buried better men and is in no hurry to be deceived. She had nearly made up her mind in his favor. That was the part that Phoebe never knew, and that the village never guessed. For all his vanity, Crispin had charm, and he had been careful in front of his great-aunt, and the dowager was lonely in the particular way of the old. And she had wanted, against her own better judgment, to believe that the boy was only young. She had drafted a will that spring, leaving the whole of her fortune to the next Duke of Hartwell. It wanted only her signature. She had carried it, unsigned, in a writing case for 6 weeks, the way a woman carries a decision she is not yet certain she can live with. Then she had gone on a wet morning to sit by her husband's grave in the Penfold churchyard, as she did on the anniversary of his death every year, alone and on foot and in plain black, so that no one would make a fuss. And she had seen her great-nephew's carriage come around the wall too fast, and she had seen the brown water rise, and she had seen the curve of his mouth as he said, "Mind the road, girl," to a woman he had knocked into the mud and would not so much as name. And she had watched the girl stand silent in the ruin of her morning's work, and make no sound. And the Dowager Lady Wycombe, who had spent 40 years learning to read men by the things they did when they believed no one of consequence was looking, had read her great-nephew entire in the space of 4 seconds, and had understood, with the cold, clean grief of a person who has hoped against the evidence and been answered, exactly what she would do. She did not do it that day. She was too old and too wise to act in anger, and she had learned that a decision made well must be made. Twice, once in the heat and once in the cold, and acted on only if it survives the second making. So she rose from the bench, and she walked the long way home to Merworth, her own house across the water meadow, and she said nothing to anyone, and she put the unsigned will back in its writing case, and she waited to see whether the cold morning would feel any different from the wet one. It did not. If anything, the cold made it plainer. Over the following days the dowager made quiet inquiries, as quiet women do, and what she learned only confirmed the road. The carriage had been her great-nephew's. The girl had been one of the Hartwell maids, a curate's daughter, named Larkspur, well thought of by the housekeeper. Never a word against her. No apology had come. No coin had been sent for the ruined linen. Crispin Vane did not know, 3 days later, that he had splashed mud on anyone at all, because the splashing of a maid had made so small an impression on him that it had passed entirely out of his mind, the way the weather passes, the way a thing of no consequence passes. And the dowager, learning that he did not even remember, found that the last of her hope went quietly out like a candle that has been guttering for a long time and is almost a relief to see finally still. Phoebe, for her part, knew none of this. She had gone home to Hartwell that morning and changed her gown and rinsed the mud from her hair in cold water at the pump. And she had said to Mrs. Dannis, Tyndall only, that she had been caught by a passing carriage, and Mrs. Domy. Tyndall had looked at the ruined linen and at Phoebe's washed blank face, and had said nothing, and had docked nothing from her wages, which was the housekeeper's particular form of mercy. And Phoebe had taken up the next basket of mending, because the work did not stop for the dignity of the person doing it, and she had bent her head over the small stitches, and let the morning close over like water over a stone. She did not know that anything had changed. She would not know for some weeks. Something had changed all the same, in the writing case at Marrowworth and in the mind of the old woman who carried it, and the change moved toward her, slow and certain as weather, while she sat with her needle and believed the world to be exactly as cruel and as fixed as it had always been. There was at Hartwell that summer one other person, whom the household had decided about and decided wrongly, and his name was Gideon Aldecott. He was a connection of the family, a second cousin to the dead Duke, through a marriage 3 generations back, the kind of relation a great house keeps, without quite knowing why. He had been raised partly at Hartwell and partly at sea, for he had gone into the Navy young, the way men of good blood and no fortune did, and he had come home the previous winter with a half-pay lieutenant's pension and a slight unevenness in his left leg, where a French ball had found it off Cadiz, and a habit of quiet that the household had mistaken for dullness. The servants thought him a poor relation, living on the family's sufferance. Crispin thought him beneath notice entirely. The county, which sorted men by their prospects, had filed Gideon Aldecott under the heading of nobody, and forgotten him. He was 38. He was tall, and he carried the unevenness in his leg with a discipline that turned it nearly invisible, and he had the kind of face that did not announce itself, a long, grave face with weather worked into it, and gray eyes that had spent years reading the horizon for trouble. He spoke little. When he spoke, it was in short, level sentences that a careless person mistook for coldness, and a careful person came to trust. He had no expectations. He had buried his expectations off Cadiz with a good deal else, and he had come home to Hartwell asking only for the small set of rooms over the old stables, and the freedom to be left alone with the dead Duke's library, which the dead Duke had loved, and Crispin had never opened. It was in that library that Gideon first spoke to Phoebe, though he had seen her many times before, and had marked her without letting himself be seen to mark her, the way a sailor marks a star without staring at it. She came to the library on the housekeeper's orders, to dust the high shelves and air the rooms that the new master would not use. And she had thought herself alone, and she had taken down a volume of Cowper and stood reading it in the long bar of afternoon light, her duster forgotten in her other hand, her lips moving very slightly over the lines. She did not know he was in the deep chair by the cold hearth. He watched her read for a full minute before he made himself known, because he did not want to startle her, and because if he was honest with the part of himself he kept under discipline, he did not want her to stop. When he shifted in the chair, she came back to herself all at once, and the color rose in her face, and she put the book down as though it had burned her. "I beg your pardon, sir," she said. "I did not know the room was taken." "It is not taken," he said. "Sit down, you were reading." "I have my work, sir. The shelves will keep." He nodded at the volume she had set down as though it were stolen. "You know, Cowper, my father liked him." She did not say more than that. She had learned not to offer her history to strangers, because servants who had once been gentlefolk were objects of either pity or suspicion, and she could bear neither. Something in the grave attention of the man in the chair, though the way he had said "sit down," not as a command but as a permission, made her add, almost against her will, "He used to read the winter evening passages aloud." The line about the loud wind whistling, I have not heard it read since. Gideon was quiet a moment. Then he said, "The frost performing its secret ministry unhelped by any wind." It was a different poet, and they both knew it, and neither corrected the other. and a small thing passed between them and the cold library that neither of them named. And Phoebe took up her duster and did not sit down, but she did not leave either. And they spoke in short, careful sentences of books for the better part of half an hour, until the light moved off the shelves and she remembered herself and went. She did not tell anyone. There was no one she would have told. She came to the library all the same, more often than the housekeeper's orders strictly required. And more often than not, the worn chair by the hearth was occupied, and the man in it would look up and offer her the other seat or hand her a book without a word. And she found that the silence between them was not the watchful silence she kept against the world, but something easier, something that asked nothing of her. To the season, she was a curate's orphan, in service, a maid with a needle, a girl to be splashed and forgotten. To the man in the deep chair, she was a person who knew Cowper, and stood very straight, and went quiet when she was wronged, and he found to his own grave surprise that he had begun to arrange his afternoons around the hope of her step on the stair. He said none of this. He was a man who had learned to want things without showing it, and he had no fortune to offer, and no name worth the offering. And he had told himself very plainly that a woman in her situation could not afford the danger of being courted by a man in his. And so he kept his hands still and his voice level, and gave her nothing but books and the use of the warm room, and told himself that was kindness and not cowardice, and was not entirely sure of the difference. The summer turned, the lawyer's documents crept forward, and the day was named on which Crispin Vane would be formally confirmed in the dukedom and would take, in the eyes of the law and the county, full possession of Hartwell. He came down from town a week before, and the house woke around him into the kind of activity that announces a new master, and he walked its rooms with the loud satisfaction of a man taking up an inheritance he has never once doubted. He did not know the names of his servants. He did not learn them. He found the half-pay lieutenant in the library, and told him with the easy cruelty of a man who thinks himself generous that, of course, Aldecott might stay on. A man must look after his poor relations, and he said it loudly enough for the footman to hear. And Gideon thanked him in 3 level words. And Crispin went away pleased with his own largeness. It was in that week that Crispin first saw Phoebe to remember her, and the seeing was the beginning of the end he could not yet imagine. She crossed the hall with a tray, and he marked her as men of his kind mark a pretty face among the furniture, and he made a remark to the steward, Mr. Osley, that was meant to be overheard and was. He called her the curate's bastard, which she was not, for her parents had been married 30 years, and he said it for the pleasure of the cruelty and the music of the alliteration, and the words ran through the servants' hall by nightfall and reached Phoebe at the supper table, where she heard them in the third-hand voice of a kitchen maid too foolish to know they would wound. She set down her spoon. She did not flush. She finished her supper because she would not give the table the satisfaction of seeing her leave it, and then she went up to the cold attic and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and let herself, for the space of perhaps 4 minutes, be exactly as tired as she was, and then she folded it away and slept, because morning came whether or not one had wept. The Dowager Lady Wycombe came to Hartwell the day before the confirmation. She came in her old black bombazine and her plain carriage, and the household turned out for her, because she was the one person at Hartwell to whom even Crispin made himself agreeable, the whole of his fortune still resting, as he believed, in her gift. He met her in the great hall with every charm he possessed, and she let him have his charm, and watched him over it with her pale, unblinking eyes, and asked in the middle of his flattery, in the mild voice of an old woman making conversation, whether he had had a pleasant journey down from town. "Tolerably, ma'am," he said. "The roads are a disgrace after all this wet. One can hardly get through the villages for the mud." "The mud," the dowager said. "Yes, I have noticed the mud." And she let the words sit a moment, looking at him. And he did not understand them at all, did not feel the edge of the blade pass so close to his throat, and she saw that he did not. And any last small doubt she might have nursed went quietly to rest. He did not remember. He would never remember. He had splashed a woman into the mud and called her a name, and would have done it again the next wet morning without a flicker. and the only thing that had changed for him was that he was now to be a duke, which would give him a great many more women to splash. She asked to see the library before she dined. She said she wished to sit a while among her brother's books, and no one thought it strange, and she went down the cold corridor on her stick, with only a footman to light her. And she opened the library door, and she found her brother's poor relation in the chair, and the two of them caught mid-sentence in a conversation about the binding of a book. The maid's face turned down to him, and lit with something the dowager had not seen on a young face in a long time. The cousin's grave attention turned up to the maid in a way that gave away to an old woman who had loved and been loved. Everything the man believed he was concealing. They sprang apart. Phoebe came down from the stool with her color high, and Gideon rose from the chair with the half-pay lieutenant's stiff bow, and both of them began to apologize at once, and the dowager raised one gloved hand and stopped them. "Sit," she said to Gideon, in the tone of a woman who has commanded a household for 50 years. "Your leg. I knew your mother. Sit." And to Phoebe, who stood twisting her duster, the old woman turned the full, pale weight of her gaze and looked at her for a long, long moment. Longer than was comfortable the way one looks at a thing one is trying to be quite sure of. "You are the curate's daughter," she said at last. "It was not a question, Larkspur. He christened my god-daughter, your father, a good man. I was sorry to hear of him." And Phoebe, who had not heard her father called a good man by anyone of consequence in 3 years, found her throat close, and could only curtsy, and the dowager saw the throat close and the chin hold steady, and added that to everything else she had been adding all that long summer, to the column on the side of this quiet girl. She stayed an hour in the library. She talked to Gideon of the Navy and of his mother and of the books his great-uncle had loved, and she drew Phoebe into it without seeming to, asking the girl's opinion of this volume and that, and watching the way the maid and the grave man spoke to each other, the ease of it, the absence in it of every calculation that governed the rest of the house. And when she rose to go into dinner, she paused at the door and looked back at the two of them and said, in the dry, mild voice she used to hide the thing she most meant, "It is a great pity that books are not money, Mr. Aldercott. You would both of you be rich." And she went in to dinner, and sat at Crispin Vane's right hand, and watched him be charming, and made her second decision in the cold, and found that it had survived. The confirmation was set for the following noon, in the long gallery before the assembled county, with the lawyers and the steward and the gentry of 3 parishes gathered to see Crispin Vane made Duke of Hartwell in form as he had so long been in his own mind. He had asked the dowager to be present, of course. He had seated her, in his arrangement of the gallery, in the great carved chair at the front, beside the chair that would be his, because the proximity of her fortune to his title was the picture he most wished the county to carry home. He did not know that he had handed her the stage she had chosen. He did not know anything at all. Before the noon gallery, though, there was the morning, and the morning held the dark hour, and the dark hour belonged, as such hours so often do, to a small cruelty that the great cruelty had set in motion. For Lady Sabine Caro had come down for the confirmation. She was the woman the county had long since married to Crispin in its collective imagination, a handsome, cold heiress of his own kind, and she had arrived the evening before with her mother and a great many trunks, and she had taken one look at the household arrangements and decided, in the manner of women who are accustomed to being the most important person in any room, that they wanted improving. She had heard, somehow, in the way such things travel below stairs and up again, that the quiet cousin in the library had grown particular about a housemaid, and the smallness of it had amused her, and the amusement had curdled as Lady Sabine's amusements did into a wish to put the housemaid in her place. So, on the morning of the confirmation, with the great house in an uproar of preparation, Lady Sabine had Phoebe sent for, ostensibly to dress her hair, the lady's own maid being indisposed, and when Phoebe came she found not a task but a trap. Lady Sabine sat at the glass in her morning gown with her cold, handsome face composed, and she let Phoebe begin on her hair, and then she began in a light conversational voice to take the girl apart. She spoke of the impertinence of servants who forgot their station, of curates' daughters who gave themselves airs, of the foolishness of poor relations who imagined that a few afternoons among books might raise a kitchen wench to a gentleman's notice. She spoke of Gideon by name. She said that a man with a ruined leg and a half-pay pension and no name to speak of had little enough to offer, but that even the leavings of such a man were too good for a maid who had been splashed in the public road and would be again. She said it precisely, watching Phoebe's face in the glass, hunting for the flinch. Phoebe did not flinch. She finished the lady's hair with steady hands, every pin true, and when it was done she stepped back and met Lady Sabine's eyes in the glass, and she said, in the level, honest voice she had learned from her father and used so rarely that it surprised even her, "You have a very fine head of hair, my lady, and I have dressed it as well as I am able. The rest of what you have said to me is not about my hair, and I do not think it is about me at all, and I will not carry it down to the gentleman as you intend, for it would shame you more than him." And she curtsied, exact and unhurried, and she left the room. And Lady Sabine sat looking at her own cold face in the glass, with the unfamiliar sensation of having struck at something and missed. It was, for Phoebe, the dark hour, all the same. She went down the back stair with her steady hands, and reached the cold landing by the still room, and there, at last, alone, the steadiness ran out of her like water from a cracked jug. She had held her chin up before the lady, because she would not give the lady her tears, but she had no fortune, and no family, and no name, and the woman in the glass had been right about every fact, even while she was wrong about everything that mattered, and Phoebe stood on the cold landing and understood, with the particular clarity of the lowest hour, that whatever she had begun to feel in the library was a thing she could not have, that the world was arranged against it in every law and every custom, and that to want it was only to teach herself a fresh way to be hurt. She resolved, on that landing, to want nothing. She would go to the library no more. She would keep her chin up and her hands busy and her heart shut, as she had before the cold spring afternoon when a grave man had said, "Sit down, you were reading." She did not know that she was overheard. For Gideon Aldercott had come down the corridor below the landing, on his uneven leg, on some errand of his own, in time to hear the last of it, the small wrenched sound of a woman weeping, who has decided not to be heard. He did not go up. He stood in the corridor below with his hand on the cold wall, and listened to Phoebe Larkspur resolved to want nothing, and he understood at last fully and plainly the cost of the discipline he had been so proud of, the cost of his level voice and his still hands and his careful kindness that had been a kind of cowardice dressed as consideration. He had given her books and the warm room and nothing he could be held to, and he had called it protecting her, and it had protected no one but himself. He stood in the corridor while she wept above him, and he made, quietly, on his own account, the decision the dowager had made on hers. He would not be a coward at noon. The noon gallery filled. The county came in its best, the gentry of 3 parishes, the lawyers in black, the steward with his papers, and at the front the great carved chair held the Dowager Lady Wycombe in her plain bombazine, upright on her dark stick, and beside her the chair that would be the new Duke's. Crispin Vane stood before the assembly in a coat that had cost a year of a footman's wages, handsome and confident, and entirely the master of the moment. And the senior lawyer read out the long form of the confirmation, the descent of the title, the entail, the lands, and the gallery, murmured its approval, and the thing was very nearly done. It is the custom at such a confirmation for the principal lady of the family to give her formal blessing to the new head of the house, and for the lawyers to read at the same time any settlement she means to make, so that the county may see the family's fortune and its title joined. Crispin had arranged for this. He had had the lawyers prepare to read, after his confirmation, the will that left the whole of the dowager's fortune to the Duke of Hartwell, the unsigned will he believed she had long since signed. It was the keystone of his whole proud mourning. He turned to his great-aunt with his finest bow and asked her, before the assembled county, whether she would do the house the honor of declaring her settlement. The Dowager Lady Wycombe rose. She rose slowly on her stick, and the gallery went quiet for her, the way a room goes quiet for the very old and the very certain, and she stood a moment looking at her great-nephew's handsome, confident face. And then she looked past him, down the length of the gallery, to where a maid in a grey gown stood among the servants at the back, brought up like all the household to witness the master's great day. She looked at Phoebe Larkspur for a moment that the whole county felt and did not understand. Then she turned back to Crispin, and she spoke, in a voice that was old and dry, and carried to every corner of the long room. "I will declare it," she said. "I had meant, this spring, to leave the whole of my fortune to the next Duke of Hartwell. I had the will drawn. I carried it 6 weeks. I did not sign it." A murmur began, and she stilled it with one lifted hand. "I did not sign it because I am old, and the old have one advantage, which is that we have seen a great many men show us what they are, and we have learned to wait for it. I waited. And on a wet morning in the Penfold Road, on the day I go each year to sit by my husband, I was shown." Crispin's smile had begun to fail. He did not yet know why. "A carriage came too fast around the churchyard wall," the dowager said, "and threw the road's water over a young woman on foot, and ruined a morning's honest work, and did not stop. The gentleman in the carriage looked out, and saw what he had done and was amused by it, and said, 'Mind the road, girl,' and drove on, and by the next day had forgotten he had done it at all. I know he had forgotten, because I asked him, 3 days ago in this house, whether the roads had troubled him, and he complained to me of the mud." She let that sit, and the gallery understood it, all at once in a single indrawn breath, and turned as one to look at Crispin Vane, whose handsome face had gone the color of the wet road. The carriage was his. "The young woman is in this room. I have watched my great-nephew the whole of this summer, and I tell you plainly, I do not give my fortune to a man who splashes a working woman into the mud, and cannot afterward remember her face. The title is his. The law gives him the title, and I cannot and would not touch it. The money my family built over 4 generations, though, is mine to give, and I do not give it to be spent by a man who has shown me, in 4 seconds, on a wet road, the whole of what he is." The lawyers stood frozen with their useless papers. Crispin found his voice, and it was not the easy-carrying voice of the carriage window now, but something higher and tighter. "Ma'am," he said, "this is a fancy, an old woman's fancy. A splash of mud? You would unmake your own family for a splash of mud. And a kitchen maid's tale." He turned to the county, to the gentry of 3 parishes, and he gathered himself, for he was not a stupid man, and he saw in a heartbeat that his whole fortune was going over a cliff, and he reached fast and hard to save it. "She is not well. She is old and grieved. And not herself. I will have the will examined. I will have the physicians attest her state. No court in England will let a great fortune be thrown away on the whim of a woman in her dotage over a wench in the road." And he said, loudly to the steward, "Ausley, you will note that her ladyship is not in her right mind. You will so attest." And to 2 of the gentlemen near him, men who owed him money or favor, he said their names and bid them mark her confusion, and they hesitated, and the room hung on the hesitation, because Crispin Vane was about to be a duke, and a duke's enmity is a heavy thing. And for one long moment it seemed that the brute weight of his rank might yet drag the morning back into his hands. It was then that Gideon Aldecott came forward from the side of the gallery. He came on his uneven leg without haste, and the county turned to the half-pay cousin it had filed under nobody, and he stopped beside the dowager's chair, and he did not raise his voice. "Her ladyship is not confused," he said in his level sailor's voice that carried without effort because the room had gone so still. "I was in the churchyard that morning. I had walked down to the village. I saw the carriage take the corner, and I saw the water thrown, and I saw the lady on the bench beneath the yew see it also. Her ladyship was as clear that morning as she is at this moment, and she has been clear every day of this summer, that I have had the honor to sit with her among her brother's books. If any physician is to be called, call one. And I will stand to what I saw, on my honor and my commission, before him and before any court in England." He let that stand. Then he turned to Crispin, and he said the thing that ended it. "You asked Mr. Osley to attest a falsehood before this whole county to save your fortune. That is what a court will hear of. Not a splash of mud, that." The steward Osley, thus named and given by a witness of unimpeachable plainness a way out of the lie he had been ordered into, found his spine. "I will attest nothing of the kind, your grace," he said. "Her ladyship is in her right mind. I have served her 30 years, and I would know." And the two gentlemen Crispin had named drew back from him, because a thing is one matter when it is winked at, and another when it has been spoken aloud before 3 parishes and a half-pay officer who has offered to swear to the truth. And Crispin Vane stood alone in the long gallery in his year's wages coat, and felt the whole weight of his certainty go out from under him at once. He did not go quietly, even then. He was confirmed Duke of Hartwell that noon, for the law is the law, and the title was his, and the dowager had said so plainly. The great unentailed fortune did not come to him, however, and without it, the title was a cold and hungry thing. A great house he could not afford to keep, and lands that ate money he no longer had, and within the year he had let the half of Hartwell go to the agents and gone abroad with Lady Sabine, who had married him, after all, and found too late that she had married the title and not the money, which had been the only thing she truly wanted. The dowager had not destroyed him. She had only declined to feed him. The difference is the whole of the difference between cruelty and justice, and she had been very careful to stay on the right side of it. When the gallery was breaking up, in the long, confused murmur of a county that has watched its certainties overturned in the space of a quarter hour, the Dowager Lady Wycombe turned in her great chair and beckoned, with one gloved finger, to the maid in the gray gown at the back of the room. Phoebe came, because one did not refuse such a summons, and she came white and steady through the parting crowd with every eye upon her, and she stopped before the old woman, and curtsied, and did not know what she had done or what was wanted of her. "You stood very straight in the road that day," the dowager said, low, so that it was nearly only for Phoebe, "and you stood very straight just now with the whole county looking at you and not knowing why. I have left my fortune, child, where I believe it will be used as my family built it, with care, and to the good of the people on the land. I have left it to a man who walked into a churchyard and told the truth at the cost of a duke's enmity, and who has loved you the whole of this summer, in the only way he knew, which was badly and silently, and without daring to ask you anything. He has my fortune now, such as a half-pay cousin may carry, and he has Merriworth, which was mine and is now his, and a competence to keep it. What he does not yet have he must ask you for himself. I am too old to do that part for him." And her dry old mouth moved into the nearest thing to a smile. She had shown in years, and she said, "Go on. He is by the window. He has been trying to catch your eye for 10 minutes, and has not the courage." Phoebe turned. Gideon Aldercut stood by the long window in the changed light, his grave face turned toward her, the discipline gone out of it at last. And she crossed the gallery to him through the breaking crowd, and the crowd which an hour before would not have let her pass without a sneer, made way for her now. Because the world had been told plainly that morning what it was looking at, and was ashamed, in the slow way of crowds, of what it had thought before. He did not make her a speech. He had no gift for speeches, and he knew it. He had spent the whole summer hiding behind his level voice, and he did not hide now. "I heard you on the landing this morning," he said low, his eyes on her face. "I heard you decide to want nothing. I have been a coward, Phoebe. All this summer I told myself I was sparing you, and I was sparing myself, and I am done with it." It was the first time he had said her given name, and he said it as though he had been keeping it, and the sound of it in his grave voice undid the last knot of the discipline she had tied so tight on the cold landing. "I have nothing that the county would call a fortune even now, and I have a leg that will never be sound, and I am 10 years older than you, and short of every grace. I would spend whatever I have even so, making certain that no carriage ever splashes you again, and, that no one ever again calls you anything but your name. Marry me! I am asking you. I should have asked you in June. And Phoebe Larkspur, curate's daughter, 24 years old, who had stood silent in the mud, and silent under the lady's cruelty, and silent through 3 years of being filed under nobody, found at last that she did not have to be silent, that there was one place in the world where her plain, honest voice was wanted. And she lifted her chin and looked at the grave-weathered face that had said, "Sit down, you were reading." And she answered him. They were married in the autumn, in the Penfold church where her father had preached, by the new curate, with the Dowager Lady Wycombe in the front pew on her dark stick and Mrs. Tyndall weeping into a handkerchief. She would later deny having brought. They went to live at Merroworth across the water meadow, the old woman's house that was a sailor's house now, and the old woman came to dinner every Sunday until she died, 2 winters on, in her own bed in her own time, with her affairs in perfect order and not one decision she regretted. On the last fair evening of that first autumn, before the cold came in, Phoebe stood at the window of the Merroworth library, which was her library now, and Gideon's, with the volume of Cowper open in her hand at the winter passages she had not heard read since her father died. The fire was lit. The grave man in the deep chair by the hearth looked up from his own book, and she did not put hers down as though it had burned her, because there was no one left to say she might not read it. Down on the road through the village, in the last of the golden light, a carriage went by, slow and careful around the churchyard wall, and threw no water on anyone at all, and she watched it pass without flinching, and then she turned from the window and read the line about the frost and the secret ministry aloud, into the warm room, to the one man who had ever asked to hear it. If Phoebe's quiet has stayed with you, stay a moment longer in that warm room before you go, and remember the old woman beneath the yew who watched and waited and saw. The world is slow. It sees in the end all the same. It saw her.